I'm Zara,
And I'm Quinn.
and you're listening to Teen Talks.
All right, before I begin, I want us to make a promise. So we're going to use the words fat and fatness as opposed to overweight, obese, or obesity. Can we do that?
Okay, I can do that. Why?
So, kind of coming from a fat studies and fat activist perspective, there's really kind of a tradition of reclaiming fat as a neutral descriptor of body size as opposed to kind of a derogatory term that it's kind of been used as opposed to the term obesity, which implies kind of a medical frame. And this medical frame kind of implies that bodies are pathological and something's inherently wrong with them or abnormal with them. So there's really not any way for us to be not fat phobic when we use the term obese, since its very use kind of implies that fat people are a medical problem to be solved rather than just a natural part of human diversity.
Okay, so so to clarify, when you see someone that you would like in your perspective you would assume to be overweight, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would use the term fat then instead of obese, like in your head, for example. Like a lot of times you add descriptors to people as soon as you see them. And what you're saying is that the mindset should be to use the word fat instead of obese, right?
Not just to use fat as a descriptor, but to use fat as a neutral descriptor. We're not adding connotations to it. There's a denotation, kind of what's written in the dictionary, and a connotation, kind of what we attach to it. And the whole point
Right.
is to use fat as a neutral word where we don't attach this connotation, as opposed to using obesity where there's an inherent connotation attached to it, and that is that it's a medical frame. And firstly, kind of, we don't have that medical frame. For most of us, we're not doctors, so we can't apply that medical frame to other people, at least not in a way that makes sense. And secondly, because of that medical frame, it kind of already implies that bodies are pathological, that there's something abnormal with them as opposed to kind of embracing them as kind of a natural range of bodies. And so I think those are kind of the two parts to using fat as opposed to obesity.
Okay, that makes sense. I feel like another thing is though is that you mentioned that, which I think a lot of people would say, that fatness is unhealthy, or like when someone is fat, um, they're doing something wrong, or they're not having a clean diet, or they're not exercising enough. So
Mm-hmm.
if you want this to be a neutral term, you're saying that fat is not an indication of those things.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, when you're saying fatness is equating to health, you're again using a medical frame that most of us don't have. We're not doctors. I know you and I aren't doctors. And we're
Of
kind of
course.
we're equating this with something that we can't equate it with. We're kind of making an assumption. We're making a leap of judgment there. Um, and I think what's most interesting about people is they assume that kind of fatness is equating to health, but that's, you know, really not true at all. Um, if you look at fat people, there are three quarters of them, about three quarters of them, who are metabolically healthy, right? These are people who are classified as obese, again, in the medical sense of the term, and medically healthy, or metabolically healthy. They show no signs of elevated blood pressure, no insulin resistance, no high cholesterol. And at the same time, about a quarter of non overweight people are what kind of epidemiologists call the lean unhealthy. That means that they do show signs of elevated blood pressure, insulin resistance, or high cholesterol. Um, and so about three quarters of fat people are actually healthier than a quarter of all, quote, lean, unhealthy people. And so I think that the myth that fatness is equating to health is kind of a misnomer there in that sense.
That's so interesting because I feel like that isn't addressed a lot. Even, like, for example, when you look at social media and you look at people who are, um, I guess, like, there's like the big girl community, is how you would phrase it. And they don't even mention things like this. It's more so of just reclaiming the word fat, kind of in the way that you're saying, is just a descriptor, simply that, nothing else, just how someone appears physically. And just this concept of people being like health being associated with how you look
Mm-hmm.
is not necessarily true at all. But I feel like that's what we do all the time because that's just us as people. Like we make judgments as soon as we see somebody. And I feel like especially in the day and age that we're in, where people are getting surgeries all the time, or people want to look a certain way, and people are trying to get with the trend, especially body trends, which are also constantly changing. I mean, like right now, I think it was, yeah, it was this year where like Kim Kardashian got rid of like a lot of her like, I guess, curviness. And it
Mm.
was kind of like this article came out, and I forget which news article it was, but it was talking about how like the heroin body was in, where it's like this super, super thin body, as if like you were kind of like a heroin addict, kind of, like that was the connotation. And so like these things are constantly shifting, and this idea of like what is good and what is healthy and what is attractive even is just, I feel like it's just getting with people, like getting in people's heads and just misinforming people in
Yeah, and I think
general.
you bring up a few really good points there. I think the first is that Americans are incredibly visual. And this is not an opinion. This is kind of a fact that's been established both by sociologists and historians, but also by scientists. We rely on visuality a lot, up until the highly educated doctors who order medically unnecessary MRIs were really heavily visual at people. And a lot of this
Right.
comes with stigma. It comes with connotations attached to it, and we kind of just shoot over there. And I think the second point that you kind of bring up is that healthiness and attractiveness and kind of what we associate visually with healthiness and attractiveness are shifting goals, right? They're not one static thing. They're things that kind of move around that we can't really attack. We can't really find them because they're constantly moving around. And the third thing that I think you bring up is that these goals are inherently kind of Eurocentric. You touched on that very briefly, but a lot of these goals, when we're shifting them around, they kind of shift around within the sphere of Eurocentricity. And as we know with fat and fatness, uh, a lot of it is very racist. A lot of the way we talk about it is incredibly racist. The history behind things like the BMI, body mass index, which used to be called the Quetelet index, after Adolf Quetelet, who invented it, who was an incredibly racist person. A lot of these things are inherently tied to race, from fat and fatness to kind of beauty and healthiness. And I say fat and fatness and beauty and healthiness because those are two separate things. Again, fatness does not equate to attractiveness. Fatness does not equate to healthiness. There's no kind of corollary between the two, and I think that's something that we're trying to establish as well.
Right. But then another question that I have is that if we're trying to essentially completely shift a mindset or a viewpoint, it's interesting to think about how one would go about that, because we can talk about the issues and the misinformation that's being spread and what we think we know versus what we actually know and what is actually, real, the reality of things. But there's also being able to actually implement that mindset, right? Being able to stop yourself from like even like subconsciously or unconsciously associating someone who you would view as fat to be unhealthy, or that they are doing, again, as I said earlier, or you were mentioning earlier, I believe too, where it's like a lot of the times people associate it with their diet or lack of exercise.
Yeah,
And so,
and sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say from like a societal perspective, like a huge, like if we're trying to impact a lot of people and a lot of people's mindset, because that is what sets the status quo, it'd be interesting to think about how that would be done.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a couple of points there. The first being that how do we really impact a great quantity of people? And I think the first is education. But even then, like you said, when we're discounting all these, myths, education doesn't really get to the core of it. Sometimes we still have those gut assumptions that we really go with. And I think that a useful reminder is that what we initially think isn't always who we are as a person. I think that for the most part, and a great many times, what you think first is not what you think. It's what society has kind of conditioned you to think. What you think second is your own opinion. Because a lot of times we're conditioned to think things, we're conditioned to feel and think a certain way, and we can't really control that. It's very hard to change that. But what we can change is that second thought, that thought that comes after.
I think you actually bring up a really good point. I didn't really think about it from that perspective, but I guess initially we do have, or we're very heavily influenced by society, and nowadays with our demographic definitely social media.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that to kind of go back on this concept of beauty, though, I feel like eventually, I think, or not eventually, but at times, this concept of even being healthy is being disregarded for beauty. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so long as you're fitting this beauty standard, and so long as the people that you want to find you attractive are finding you attractive, you might take that as a priority over your own health. And thus, I feel like then we just shift to this perspective on, like, okay, this is just what looks the best. And we just completely disregard, as I said, health.
Yeah, and that goes back to kind of that lean unhealthy that we were talking about earlier. That 1/4 of the um, normal weight population who are actually metabolically unhealthy. And again, we don't associate them with unhealthiness because we associate them with normality or attractiveness. We're not pathologizing their bodies. And especially skinniness, I think, is another thing to look at. Statistically, they're equally abnormal. Skinniness and fatness, they're equally
Right.
abnormal. Abnormal meaning deviating from the statistical norm, but we don't associate the abnormalness of being skinny with unhealthiness. We don't associate it with unattractiveness. And I think that that's part of the stigma that our society brings into it. They're equally unlikely, they're equally abnormal, as much as we can use the word, but we don't describe them as abnormal. We don't pathologize their bodies because we view them as something to be attained, some sort of goal, some sort of beauty goal. Kind of like you were talking earlier with the heroin body being the new fad. Um,
Right. And then now I'm thinking about, obviously, like, this is a really big concern and a very big misinformation, as, again, I think this is like the third time I'm saying this, but at the same time, when we're talking about education on this, in what setting would one be educated in this? Like, if we're talking about, like, I mean, okay, I feel like this could be spread around social media or through various platforms, but then again, there are so many people telling you different things. Like, for me, for example, when I had TikTok and I was on the workout side of TikTok, there would be like five different people telling me five different things and essentially critiquing each other. And they were all claiming that they were professionals in their own way, and they were all like essentially saying that this is like the way that you need to go. And so I feel like there's a now like a level of cautiousness that I go about learning things, because I feel like there is value, because the majority of our demographic and just a lot of people are turning towards social media because, again, so many people are using it. But at the same time, there's so much contradictions that are introduced as well. And
mm-hmm.
so I was thinking, when you said education, I immediately assumed, or not assumed, but associated that with formal education. And so I was thinking about that and how that could be done. Like in physical education, for example, maybe even having an aspect of learning about the body, the human body, and how it works in terms of metabolism, and how it works in terms of just talking about this and talking about how to just maintain a healthy lifestyle rather than going after words like fat, skinny, and such. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting thing because education is both formal and informal, both cultural and non-cultural, kind of global in a sense, but it's also very specific. And I think that you bring up a very good point about we have to be very wary of this informal education. I mean, on average, the average American consumes 0 peer-reviewed pieces of literature a day. I mean, how many journal articles does the average person read a day that has been in a peer-reviewed journal? Almost none. And so I think that it comes down to A, doing your own research, but B, also kind of changing the system, like you said. It comes down to the very basics. I mean, even beyond an educational level, at the building block of what we subsidize to eat, agriculturally, we subsidize fruits and vegetables the least, the least out of all food products. We subsidize it the least, and it starts on that level, on what we actually see in stores, what we are available to buy, and then it comes to the educational level, where we're thinking about it on a more meta level, if you will. Kind of, if you know the story about the fish in the water, there are two fish swimming in the water, and one of the older fish says, "Oh, the water's pretty cold today," and the other fish says, "What's water?" I think educationally, we need to focus on this what's water. We need to take a step back and look on a more meta level about what's going on. What are we surrounded with? What are we being inculcated with? But that being said, we also have some more stuff to helpfully educate our listeners. And so we've talked a little bit about how fatness doesn't equal health, but let's talk about how fatness isn't calories. Thinness isn't diets, and obesity isn't one condition. I mean, if you look at it, obesity can be a variety of conditions. I know there's one person who had to treat their obesity after they had a brain cancer and they had a tumor that caused them to regain a great amount of weight, right? Some people are genetically indisposed to it, right? Obesity is not one condition. A lot of people think
Right.
that obesity is a condition of consuming too many calories. It's a simple calculation of calories in and calories out. Calories consumed and energy expended. And we know it's really not that. The Endocrine Society talks about how growing evidence indicates that obesity pathogenesis, that is kind of the origin of it, involves a process really far more complex than the passive accumulation of excess calories. It goes beyond calories. And more than that, if you're trying to think, oh, well, there's good calories and bad calories, that's really not true either, right? Thinness is not a diet. 2/3 of people who go on a diet gain more weight than they lost, right? They gain back more weight than they lost. Diets have been shown scientifically through peer-reviewed articles, and we'll link sources down below, to not help. And so I think that just these three basic facts, that fatness is not an accumulation of calories, that thinness is not a matter of diets, and that obesity isn't one condition, are kind of the building blocks of understanding fatness and understanding kind of what goes into it and kind of destigmatizing it.
I also think an interesting thing to think about, or just to consider as well, is that things are very subjective to, as Quinn was mentioning, to who you are individually and how your body works. So just because a certain diet or a certain exercise regimen works for one person, or at least appears to work for one person, it might not necessarily work for you. And I think that has been a really big thing, especially on social media. As I was mentioning before, there's this really big culture of, this is the diet that you need to try, or these are the foods that you need to be eating, or these are the exercises you need to be doing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times it just I just think it depends on your biology and how you work, and sometimes it will work based on your body type as well, because certain things work for you and certain things work for other people. And I think kind of having this concept that, oh, if this thing works for them and this makes them like have this hourglass body, it's definitely going to work for me. And then if it doesn't work for you, you kind of spiral into this like big depression, which is why we're having like such high depression rates, like abnormally high depression rates as, the years are proceeding on. It's just because of these things like this, like small things that you would think are kind of small, they all accumulate into like our mental health as well. And then our mental health affects our physical health and vice versa. And so you're kind of in this cycle as well. And I feel like we definitely need to break out of it. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting point about what works for one person doesn't work for another. When we look at stigmatized fatness, we look at one person, and that is kind of the natural man, as doctors used to call it, kind of back in the day of Adolphe Quetelet, the homme moyen, the average man, the normal person, man in this sense, kind of referring to all of mankind. But the average person, we think, oh, it should work for one person, why doesn't it work for another? But when you really break it down, stigma kind of covers up that individuality. I mean, let's take a look at eating disorders. You look at a skinny person with an eating disorder, they have a problem. It's medically diagnosable. They need help. There's a pathogenesis, everything. When you look at a big person, a fat person, who has the same behaviors, who eats the same, who exercises the same, they're suddenly doing a good job. They're being a quote-unquote good fat person, right? But trying to lose this weight. and yet they still have an eating disorder. It's just that it goes undiagnosed because stigma tries and covers that up. And so I think that when we're looking at this quote unquote average person, it's really a double standard. We're applying the standards of average people onto fat people. But when fat people kind of go outside of that abnormal behavior or that normal behavior and it becomes abnormal behavior, we cover it up anyways. And so I think that that's one of the greatest effects of stigma. And it really kind of sets that double standard for fat people.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I feel like and I think another thing is that we know our bodies best, or ideally you would know, even if you don't know your body that well, you know it relatively well in the sense that how good your metabolism is, or just like very basic things, like how good your digestion is and such. And I feel like we also apply that to other people. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why it's just very hard for other people to be able to like, or no, it's very easy for other people to just like immediately say things to other people, for example, or just be like, oh, you should try this or you should try that, even unwarranted, like without like someone saying, oh, like I want to lose weight or like I'm trying to do X, Y, and Z. And so
Yeah,
I feel
and
like that's also, yeah.
that's especially the case with fat people, right? You look up, even anecdotally, you hear thousands of fat people sharing their stories. They'll receive kind of uninvited advice from family, from friends, and then even from medical professionals. And the reason is what seems uninvited on the fat person's end, on the receiving end, is required by medical insurance. Every time someone is diagnosed with obesity or diagnosed as overweight, every doctor visit they have, their doctor is required to bring up their weight. Required. And so really we're setting this double standard. And at the same time, when doctor visits are going down in time but increasing in frequency, it's really cutting more into that. And so it's not giving good advice because the doctor doesn't know this person incredibly well. They're not spending the quality time they need to, and yet they're offering this advice, and really against this sense of individuality, as we talked about.
I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but is this the same for people who are underweight?
That I don't know. I know it's definitely required for people who are overweight. But it's a good question about people who are underweight, because again, it goes back to that abnormality question. People who are underweight are equally as normal as overweight people, but we don't apply the same double standards to them, at least not all the time. And sometimes we can even apply more. It really just depends. But that's a good question, which I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, I think we can follow up on that later, but I think that would just, again, as you were saying, that'd be interesting to see if that kind of seeps deeper in a medical setting as
Mhm.
well.
I think one last point I have to make about stigma and fatness is that America hates fat people. And for one of the fattest countries in the world, it's really odd, you might think, for America to hate fat people. But the thing is, thin people hate fat people, but fat people hate fat people. And I know you might get on my back for saying that, oh, you can't generalize that, you can't say fat people hate fat people. But the truth is that fat people grow up in the same fat-hating culture that everyone else does, right? And the thing is they can't find solace in each other. It's not like being other groups of minorities. It's not like being Asian. It's not like being gay, because you can't claim an identity if everyone else is saying that it shouldn't exist. And that's the case with obesity. They're saying that this identity shouldn't exist in the first place, and they can't claim that and find solace in peer relationships like that. And so they're incredibly isolated because they grow up in a fat hating culture, and they end up hating fat people as well. Not hating per se, but they isolate themselves because of this fat hating culture. They feel unwell in each other's company. And this goes into scientific studies, but also just anecdotally. You can find plenty of stories out there about this. And I think that's one of the worst parts about this stigma. Not just that it kind of imposes a double standard, not just that it has all these things related to mental health and to physical health, but that people can't find solace in each other, not like other minority groups. And it really isolates them, and that really takes a toll on mental health in the end, and ultimately on their weight itself, right? It's been shown that fat people who can find a group, a support group that really understands and supports them and shares in that identity, and doesn't face as much stigma, and B, because of the results of that not facing as much stigma, loses more weight on average. So it's really quite the double standard that we've imposed.
I definitely agree. I think when you were mentioning a different term for kind of self-hate, it also just reminded me of like just something like internalized, where like
Yes,
I can
yes.
think of it as like internalized racism, but except with weight. And additionally, I think that nowadays there's an interesting juxtaposition because on one side there are celebrities like Lizzo, for example, who like she promotes. I know that on her like pages she promotes like very like healthy eating, like quote unquote healthy eating, and just like kind of. I think she also has like a brand for like kind of like wearing like very attractive, like I don't know, she has like her whole like brand is kind of reclaiming this idea of being fat, and also just like vibing with it, and just being like showing that she is living healthily, and that she's beyond just fat and kind of having other labels associated with her, rather than her just simply being like a singer who advocates, or who's like who advocates for herself and whatnot. She kind of shows other aspects to herself. And there are other people like Kelly Clarkson, for example, who does kind of like the same thing, but not so much. But then again, I feel like there are other celebrities who were considered fat and have like lost significant weight and are now like considered a lot more attractive, or like there's a lot of like, compliments to them and stuff like that. I think the most recent one I can remember is Adele. She lost like a ton of weight. And I remember the internet went completely crazy because on one hand, some people were like, "Oh my gosh, she looks so good," and then other people were like, "Oh, like why did she have to like lose that much weight?"
Hmm.
And so like I think it's interesting because it's all happening within the same time frame. Where again, you have Lizzo, who I think it's Yeti, that her brand that she has, which is like I think lingerie, but like it's to kind of like empower, and it has like bigger sizes because it's supposed to like empower like people with bigger bodies, because again, as you said and as you were talking about, just because you have a bigger body does not necessarily equate to you being unhealthy or healthy or whatnot. And so while that's happening, again, there are also these big, celebrities that were kind of really associated with being fat, or being, yeah, for being fat, losing all this weight because of Hollywood, and then that feedback as well. So I feel like those kind of clash a little bit, and I'm not really sure. I feel like these are just happening simultaneously. So while we're
Hmm.
going forward in that way, we're kind of going backward in another way, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
we live in a competing culture, right? There's not just the fat anti-fat and the pro-fat or the fat acceptance movement. It's that within that fat acceptance movement, we're simultaneously saying, "Oh, we accept fat bodies, we accept large bodies, we love them, we promote them, not promote them, but we accept them for who they are." And yet at the same time, the goal for these fat acceptance movements is still to lose weight. It's still to
Right,
lose weight,
exactly.
despite them saying
Exactly.
we love and accept these big bodies. And I think that even in the fat acceptance movement, there is another double standard. There is kind of an insidious, under the sheets kind of fat hate.
Exactly. And so that's like an interesting concept to think, or like to really think about, beyond just a surface level, to see like how kind of like that all stems into that idea, and kind of trying to change that, right? Trying
Hmm.
to shift a whole perspective, which is so deeply rooted in various different aspects of like society. And so it's not just black or white, it's a very big gray area. And as you said, the first step is just education and learning about things, but then also just a self reflection and thinking about it on your own, and how kind of this mindset can affect how you view different things, and perhaps see things that you didn't see before.
Yeah. And the note I kind of want to end it on is something that you touched on very briefly, is that people like Lizzo are not just living healthily, they're living happily. And I think that's an important part that we forget a lot of the time, is that it's not just about being healthy, metabolically healthy, physically healthy, mentally healthy. It's about being happy. It's the fat acceptance movement shouldn't just about be saying that, oh, fatness does not equate to unhealthiness. That's great and all, but what we should be saying is that fatness does not equate to unhappiness. Just because you are fat does not mean that you are destined to live an unhappy life. Does not mean that you're disadvantaged. Does not mean that you're being taken away from something, right? People like Lizzo, they're living healthily, great. Most of all, they're living happily. All right, thanks for listening.